Could you take your seats, please? I'd like to begin the meeting. Well, good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Fisheries Committee of this new mandate, and look forward to working with you over the next 5 years. And just very conscious of this committee that there's just so many issues. It's a small committee, but lots of issues, some of them outside our control, of course, climate change, our third country actions, and all the time we have to remember that the actions we take here affect people's lives, and sometimes we have to look to the long term because we've got to protect our fish stocks and build up those fish stocks if the industry is to have a future. But at the same time, we are conscious of the short-term pressures. But I think we all want to see a successful, long-term, secure, profitable future for an industry, and we need to ensure that we have the fish to provide the resource that industry needs if it is to succeed. So, without further ado, let's get on. First item is the adoption of the agenda, and unless there are any objections, I propose that we duly adopt it. I see no objections, so the agenda is approved. The second item, I have to say, is that it's sad news, and it concerns Mr. Bradford, a new colleague from Portugal, from the Azores, who was expected to join us, but we've received notification of his death last week. I have to say I was very much looking forward to working with him. I deeply regret this news, and with your permission, on behalf of the committee, I will send a letter of condolence to his family. Thank you. I propose now the adoption of the minutes of the constitutive, how do you pronounce that? The set-up meeting of the 10th of July. Any objections to the minutes? Thank you. I move that they deemed to be approved. And now we move on to the draft budget. I have to say that in taking the chair's position, I was presented with the draft budget that had been drawn up by the Secretariat, and more or less that is the document that's been presented to you. It is, of course, just an opinion to the budget committee, and it will be open for your modifications, and amendments, I think, have to be tabled by Thursday noon. Now, where's the Commission representative? I'm not used to sitting up here. Way at the back. So, this is Dora Carrera. Have I pronounced that right? Mrs. Carrera, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. President. Honourable members, Mr. President, it's an honour and always a pleasure to be back in this committee. And allow me to start by wishing you all the best for this legislature. We start with a bit of an arduous point, which is indeed the draft budget for 2020. 2020 is the last year of this financial period. As we all know, we are now discussing the budget for the next financial period, 2021-2020. So 2027, sorry. So next year is a year which is important in terms of consolidating what we have achieved and sending a strong message in terms of implementation for the ones discussing the next financial period. So in terms of the budget for maritime affairs and fisheries, we are proposing the following amounts for next year. In terms of commitments, i.e. the money we commit to spend in 2020 and subsequent years, the Commission is proposing over 1 billion euros. And in terms of payments, so to honor our obligations from past years, we are proposing 960 million euros. This money covers three things. It covers our European Maritime and Fisheries funds. It covers our international fisheries agreements and organizations. And it covers the fisheries control agencies in Vigo. If you allow me, President, I will just say a few words about each of these three components. The bulk of our expenditure is, of course, the structural fund, the EMFF, which is 90% in shared management. Shared management means that member states are the ones implementing and managing this money. So the idea for next year is to allow for a continued implementation of the programs, and for that we have proposed 858 million euros. This is member states' responsibility, of course, but it's something that we are monitoring very, very closely in the Commission. And here I have good news for you. As we know, the EMFF had a bit of a slow start at the beginning in 2014, but now, based on the implementation reports from last year, it is reaching its cruising speed in member states. At the end of last year, we had around 33,000 projects ongoing in member states, and this is twice as many as the year before, as in 2017. The value of this project is around 5 billion euros, and half of that is paid by our fund. All in all, it means that around half of our EMFF has now been committed and is being spent. This is for the part which is managed by member states, so the 90% of the fund. 10% of the fund is managed by the Commission, mainly for maritime policy and accompanying measures for the implementation of the common fisheries policy, like scientific advice. Here, our financial planning for 2020 was established on the basis of identified needs and, of course, in full respect of the thematic distribution of funds in the EMFF regulation. Moving now to the second part of the budget, the part supporting sustainable fisheries partnership agreements and the regional fisheries organizations. Here we are asking for 142 million euros for next year. This covers, of course, the fisheries agreements which are in force, but also those which are expected to be in force in 2020, like Morocco. Now we had just had the ratification by the Moroccan authorities. We also plan to cover the agreements renewed in 2019, like Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, or in 2020, like Senegal and the Seychelles. So for this part of the budget, you have money which we are sure to spend, and then we have money that we set aside in case these negotiations are successful and we need the money, and this is a reserve line in the budget. Finally, as regards our agency in Vigo, the European Fisheries Control Agency, we have proposed 16.7 million euros, which is in line with the agreement made between Parliament and Council at the time of the Coast Guard regulation, so the agreement between EFCA, Frontex and EMSA. And of course, this is in addition to the core business of the agency in terms of control and implementation of the CFP. Finally, as regards pilot projects and preparatory actions, we just received from the Parliament the list of proposed pilot projects and actions from this committee, and we are now proceeding with this assessment. We'll come back to you very shortly. Let me just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by welcoming the draft opinion. I just wanted to note that as regards our budget for Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreements, the Council has cut our estimates by 4 million, and we would pretty much appreciate the support of the Parliament in reinstating our original request. I, of course, welcome any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commission. I'll take coordinators first, if Mr. Myanmar.
I'm wearing two hats today. I'm not just a coordinator, but I also represent the shadow rapporteur, Ms. Montero de Aguiar, who wasn't able to attend today's meeting for personal and family reasons. So I have her speaking notes here. If you permit, I could read them out. Perhaps I could speak first as shadow rapporteur, reading her notes, and then afterwards I could speak in my own name, or would you like me to do it in a reverse order? What would you prefer? Should I just do both? Okay, well, in any case, from Ms. Montero de Aguiar first, she tells us the following. She's the shadow rapporteur again for my group. She says that this draft opinion on the budget is balanced, as prepared by the chair. It covers the main points such as agriculture, the small-scale fleets, coastal fleets, the Vigo agency, and of course Brexit. Now our position, according to Ms. Aguiar, is in line with Mr. Davies' position and agrees that it can only be achieved through efficient and effective use of the funds in order to ensure the jobs of millions of people and food safety from the maritime sector, that we need to fight for a better scientific base for our work, and we also need to better understand our seas in order to ensure the best possible policy. We also feel that the blue economy in all its aspects should be a focus, and it should offer more added value to coastal communities. It would like to emphasize the importance of the sea for sustainable fisheries and our future, without forgetting the men and women who live from the sea and depend on it. And so our proposals for minor amendments or changes to the budget would have to be in line with our main objectives. And Ms. Aguiar concludes by saying that there needs to be a balance between the environmental and socioeconomic aspects of fisheries. So that would be the brief text that the shadow rapporteur sent me. Now, on my own behalf, let me just say that in principle I can agree with your proposal, Chair. I will be tabling two minor amendments, one in order to further emphasize the importance of the third country agreements, the Sustainable Fisheries Partnership Agreements, which are very important, which of course have budgetary implications. This is a point that the Commission representative already said. Now, of course, today we know that the European fleet is going back to Morocco, and this is a sign of the good health of these agreements. And the second minor amendment will be to, again, further emphasize the idea that with a view to the next financial framework, up to 2027, that we need to be ambitious for fisheries in the budget. That's what we need. And that Brexit should not form a barrier to ensuring that the budget is ambitious. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Can I just ask, what do you mean by ambitious in this instance?
That there should not be any cuts, as is being proposed right now in the financial framework. On the contrary, we need to actually up the amount.
Mrs. Aguilera.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. The shadow rapporteur for my group is Mr. Colbert, who will be joining us later this morning. Just briefly, I wanted to say that I can agree with the opinion that's been drafted by the chair on the budget. I have got a question for the Commission representative, Dora Correa. There seems to be a problem with the implementation of the EMFF, and that the national operative programs were adopted very late in the day, and so the implementation of this operative program was very, very slow indeed. So we've been told now today by the Commission representative that we're reaching cruising speed, apparently, and this is a good thing, of course. We've still got a year before the end of this current financial framework, or a year and a half, and I'm very pleased to see that we're on track. But I do have a question. We've been given some information, but I would like to know whether, if she's got it, what is the exact percentage of implementation of these operative programs to date? Now, I did hear some figures, but I didn't note them fully down. Perhaps it was about 50% implementation. I don't know if that's the right figure. But in any case, I would like to have a bit more details to what exactly is the percentage of expenditure on the programs, of what's already committed and what's been paid for these operative programs. Also, it was said that there's this 4 million that's been cut from the budget. And we're being asked as a parliament to add that back in the proposal coming from the parliament. Now, I've always said that in this parliament, we've always been in favor of promoting the budget, returning funds that have been cut. But I would like to know from the Commission representative about these 4 million euros that have been cut. I must say, I haven't actually seen them. Perhaps you could tell me where exactly they are in the budgetary line, which line they affect. Thank you.
It's quite detailed questions there. I wonder if the Commission would like to come back before we take some more. Ms. Carrera?
Yes. So thank you for those questions. In terms of the execution of the implementation of the EMFF, the figure I mentioned in my opening statements was that 45% of the EMFF was now committed to be spent. This in terms of the overall figure. In terms of the actual payments made on the ground, the EMFF is now at 23% of money spent. And just to give you a comparison with other funds, the Fund for Regional Development, so the ERDF, is now at 28%, and the ESF, the European Social Fund, is at 30%. So we consider these figures to be quite good because, as you know, we started a year later. We had to wait for the adoption of the legal basis. And then, as you just said, the operational programs took quite a while to be adopted and put in place by the member states. Now, this is the overall figure for the 27 member states. Luxembourg does not have a program. This is the overall figure. And, of course, within member states, there are divergences. But this is the overall figure for the fund. And when I say we are at cruising speed, it's because, in fact, in 1 year, we have doubled the implementation. So this means that things are really happening on the ground now. Oh, sorry, for the 4 million. The 4 million was cut in the SFPA, so in the Fishery Partnership Agreement, part of the budget, and they were cut in the reserve line. So the money we set aside for agreements which are being negotiated now, and we expect them to be in force next year. And I think the Council is maybe a little bit less optimistic than we are, so they thought that they could take those 4 million away. We believe that we are able to spend that money, so we would like to have those 4 million back in the reserve.
Mrs. Tomasic.
Thank you, Chair. I'm slightly concerned regarding the 8.7 to the 29% concerning technology and equipment, which of course will pose problems in connection with control. I also believe we need higher funds for landings and all obligations in connection with landings. Also, scientific research is quite important, especially when it comes to implementation and preparation of multi-annual plans. Of course, I will have some amendments in connection with this matter as well. Thank you.
Mrs. Conte?
So, dear colleagues and Chairman, the financial allocations on scientific advice should be kept at the same level. Our amendments will focus on matters of socio-economic importance, particularly the importance of small-scale fisheries. Around 75% of those registered in the EU, and half the jobs in the sector. Greater resources should go to small-scale fisheries, particularly with regard to implementation of the landing obligations and diversification of the economy, including into the tourism sector. We think it's vital that appropriate financial resources go to proper use of resources. And I would like to recall that fishermen do have responsibility for stocks and proper management. There are other issues, though: pollution, variation of biomass, and so on. And we should consider other environmental services, such as disposal, collection of plastics at sea. And the function of guardians of the sea of our fishermen should be acknowledged, and proper financial resources should be given to the advisory councils as well. They have a very in-depth knowledge of the particular territories and their specific features, and the regionalisation of policies set out in our plans. It is vital to make sure that the EMFF is simplified as far as possible so that operators can get full benefit from this. And then there's the issue of Brexit and the threat of negative effects on fisheries and the EMFF. Appropriate support measures need to be put in place to deal with the consequences. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Mrs. Dodds.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Commission for making the presentation. In relation to the EMFF, you say that 40% of the money is committed, 23% is actually spent. Is there any breakdown on how that money is spent, as in vis-a-vis support for coastal communities versus sustainable fisheries, and how we and I mean sort of scientific projects to actually make sure that we have a more sustainable fishery going into the future? The one thing that you would expect me to raise is the issue of Brexit. The United Kingdom is due tomorrow to get a new Prime Minister. Whoever that Prime Minister turns out to be has indicated that we will be leaving the European Union on the 31st of October. I have listened very carefully to how you have looked at the monies and the issue of the EMFF. And I don't see where you intend to support fisheries in the event that there is not a deal with the United Kingdom. I think that with the continuing fairly tough stand of the Commission and the position in the UK Parliament where it is deemed that the backstop is unacceptable, I think that there is a very real possibility that the United Kingdom will leave without a deal. I don't want that. I have said repeatedly in these committees and in Parliament that we should leave in an orderly fashion with a proper deal and everything worked out so that everyone has certainty. But I'm just interested in how you are going to look at the EMFF, how you're going to support fisheries, because the United Kingdom will take back control of its seas, and therefore there will have to be negotiations and agreement with the United Kingdom and potential ramifications for Europe's fisheries sector. Thank you very much.
Okay, for time reasons, I'll ask the Commission to come back. I'll take some other questions first, but I take it the Commission has noted that, that specific question. Mrs. Schreier-Pierik.
Voorzitter, dank u wel.
Thank you very much, Chair. I can agree with the last question that was asked on Brexit. From the Netherlands and my country, this is a very important question. I was recently in the United Kingdom. We actually drafted a letter about this, so I very much agree with the last comment. As to the question about the 45% and the 32%, what exactly is that paying for? And another question, another point. Now, we can't have a situation where right now we're researching for research's sake. We're looking at fisheries that which also has their own figures available. So the question is, what is the aim of all of this research? What is it we want to be targeting? The fact is, in the Netherlands, The fishers have got their own figures, but our main university, Wageningen, is busy doing its research, and it's doing a research just for research sake, and it's all busy with its own investigations. And the fishermen have already got all their figures ready and lined up for us. So I think we really need to stay on top of things as a committee, and I think it's very important to consider that. Thank you.
Mr. Ferreira.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank the Commission representative for joining us today, and also thank her for the information she's given us. Let me just say that with respect to the EMMF, I tend to have a different opinion from that that's been expressed by the Commission. We actually don't think that we can consider the current situation satisfactory with respect to the commitment and the payments levels. Now, all of the various factors that were raised by the Commission, of course, need to be considered, but we think that there's room for improvement, and all of this really is based on the fact that the fund is oriented in a certain way. It really needs to tackle realities and the actual issues facing the fisheries sector. So it might be useful if the European Commission, as we reach the end of the current financial framework and programming period, that the Commission, instead of trying to gild the lily and say that everything's okay and it's all going to be fine by the end, that we shouldn't worry, that perhaps the Commission instead should start withdrawing certain issues and moving them to the next programming period. Because unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to be able to meet our objectives now, and there's not much set for the next period yet. So it would be useful. Well, we saw what the Parliament decided and said at the end of the last legislative term with respect to the EMFF. And it would be helpful if these comments made by the Parliament back then could be taken on board fully by the Commission. And we would avoid these sorts of knee-jerk reactions, rejecting outright various points that have been made by the Parliament in its proposals. I think also, I don't know if the Commission has considered this, but I'm looking at various points for discussion, and the fact that we cannot be happy with the current situation given the circumstances, even comparing it against all of the various other structural funds, that it would be useful if at this point the Commission could also, in addition to thinking to the future programming period, try to think about what sort of preparatory work could be done. For instance, the Commission, for instance, might propose pilot projects or preparatory actions. It's not common that the Commission would do that, but perhaps I could launch the challenge to the Commission for that, as to what could possibly be considered in terms of pilot projects or preparatory actions, any new actions in the area of fisheries that they might envisage. Now, I know this isn't a common form of proceeding, but perhaps I can also take this opportunity to ask the Commission what its view is about the pilot projects that have already been adopted in this area. I'm thinking particularly of one, which is support measures for small-scale coastal fisheries and artisanal fisheries. There was also a pilot project that was adopted in this area, and I don't know if the Commission could tell us anything at this stage about how that pilot project was going. Yes, I'm just wrapping up now. So I'd like to hear what the Commission has to say about this pilot project. Thank you.
Got two other speakers, and I'm closing the list there. So that's three other speakers, and that'll be it. Ms. Tardino.
Sì. Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. Well, the availability of appropriate financial measures for fisheries is absolutely vital, of course. If we're to achieve the objectives of the common policy. So I would agree with the general thrust of the opinion as drafted by the chair, but I would table certain amendments along the lines of what our coordinator, Mrs. Conte, said. And I'd just like to add something about coastal regions. I'm from Sicily, and I represent Sicily and Sardinia, and recent EU measures have really penalized the sector in these areas. 982 of 19 on provisions for fisheries in the area of the CGPM agreement, limiting fishing in the Channel of Sicily and the Ismed, and there was an improvement on the Commission's original proposal, but this really does penalise our fisheries and our island. There are legitimate requirements for sustainability, but fisheries and maritime affairs are a source of economic growth and make an active contribution to the areas concerned and management of natural resources, and the socio-economic dimensions of fisheries for local communities are very important, and coastal and island fishing is very important there. A lot of families depend on those resources, and those depending on fisheries are penalised by additional costs, and I think these should be compensated for by additional resources. So we will table certain amendments, and I do hope that colleagues will be able to support them. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Monteith?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Commission representative for the presentation. The opinion before us is, of course, suggestions into a motion for a resolution, and I note point 3 that discusses more than half of the Union's supply of fisheries products come from international waters and exclusive economic zones of third countries. Of course, once Brexit happens, that proportion will grow considerably. And point 3 does point to the need for adequate and reliable budgetary provisions in 2020. Moving on to point 10, it draws reference to Brexit. And it says that the utmost importance needs to be given to the establishment of new financial budgetary framework for 2021-27. But as Mrs Dodds has pointed out, there's no reference to what might happen in 2020. It does seem odd to me that with the possibility of a no-deal Brexit, that there is no mention of this in the suggestions for a resolution. Has there been any provision for adjustment to the budget were the United Kingdom to leave, whether it be on the 31st of October or any point before 2020, any financial provision been made? And if not, would it not be advisable to add a clause into this opinion that in fact some provision should be made so that there can be adequate support provided for fisheries once Britain takes back control of its fisheries itself?
Thank you. Look forward to hearing the response from the Commission. And final speaker is Mr. Bito. Monsieur Bito.
Well, I would just like to take the floor, as others have done, to bear witness to the difficulties as representative of the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region. We have had difficulties with regard to the funds, aquaculture, fisheries, and so on. But I'm glad to see that the regions have mobilised to make sure that the funds really do work and are effective. As we're having a debate on the budget, looking at the strong points and weak points today, I would like to mention one point about the EMFF, on the agreements with other countries, and state that, of course, we need agreements with countries, and I think the Brexit issue will lead us to that. But I think maybe we need to think about a global approach. I have difficulties with the idea of having agreements with particular countries when you're talking about a mobile and moving resource. When we're talking about Guinea-Bissau or Mauritania, we know that Senegal's fish resources may be impacted by that as well. So before concluding those agreements, I think we need to think in more global terms, a global approach. And the same goes when we talk about Brexit. This country is leaving the EU, and we need to strike agreements for sustainable management of fish resources, whether this country is a member of the EU or not. So this brings us back once again to the need for a global approach. And then a brief comment. This committee is the Committee on Fisheries. I think that's a bit reductive, or I fear that in any case. I mean, when we're talking about fish and fisheries resources, I don't think we should just talk about fisheries. The EMFF concerns aquaculture, the seas, fisheries, fishing. So maybe we should be thinking in terms of incorporating the seas or ocean in our name and what we do, because I think that's the key to what we do. We're talking about what is taken from the sea by fishermen. We need to look beyond the primary activity and include the quality of ecosystems and the oceans as well.
Thank you. I look forward to hearing your response to the first time we debate a fisheries partnership agreement. So can I ask Mrs. Correa for the Commission to respond to the points made by members?
Thank you, President. Indeed, quite a rich debate. Let me start by the Brexit question, because it was raised by a number of honourable members. So, of course, we all expect that the UK leaving the European Union will be made in an orderly manner and on the basis of the agreed withdrawal agreement. This being said, if that wouldn't be the case, the Commission approved, and it was approved also by the co-legislators, a series of preparedness measures, including for fisheries and maritime affairs. These measures were adopted on the 25th of March last, and for our area they include basically two things. On the one hand, they include the possibility that member states most affected and the fleets most affected by a possible withdrawal of access to UK waters would be able to mobilize additional funds for temporary cessation, i.e. payments to fishermen who are unable to go out and fish. That's one of the measures we have foreseen. The other measure is a change to our fishing licensing and authorization system to allow for granting of individual licenses for fishermen allowed to fish in UK waters as a third country. These were the preparedness measures we have adopted, and we know that there's lots of uncertainty, but we hope that these two measures will give some stability and certainty to our fishermen. In terms of different questions about what the fund is actually doing, because of course I've given you numbers on implementation. This is very dry. What we want to know is actually what the fund is achieving. It will be very long for me to give you a detailed account, but if the President agrees, I would be sending the Secretariat a report, which we do every year, on what the structural funds actually do in Member States, and also a link to a database where we have all the projects funded by the EMFF. And there you will see what is being done in different member states with our fund. I think that's probably the shortest answer to the different questions which were raised. On the implementation figures, I think we can look at the glass half empty or at the glass half full. Of course, the fact that we have actually spent 23% of the fund that we plan, that 45% are committed, per se can be interpreted in different ways. I prefer to see the glass half full, not only because we have achieved enormous progress in the last 2 years, but also, as a member has put it, I think we need to acknowledge the enormous efforts being done by national and regional authorities to make sure that the opportunities offered by the fund are taken up on the ground. In terms of small-scale fisheries, there were a few questions asked as well. The EMFF foresees a special treatment for small-scale fishermen, and in some cases even an aid intensity rate of 100%. So this is already a very clear signal that the EMFF supports small-scale fishermen. Also, for the next proposal, for the next period, we have proposed even to reserve some types of measures, like, for example, buying a second-hand vessel or modernizing an engine. We have proposed to reserve these measures to small-scale fishermen. So we are indeed aware that these fishermen have specific needs. A final answer on the SFPAs. I think you have a discussion this afternoon on a number of SFPAs with my colleagues. There is indeed this global approach to sustainability, and there is indeed taking up concerns in terms of the environmental and socio-economic sustainability of local fleets, but my colleagues are much more of experts in those areas, and I'm sure they'll be very happy to answer your questions this afternoon. I would stop here, but of course, if ever there are any follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them up bilaterally or in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Amendments are due in by noon on Thursday. And please note that, as Chair, as Rapporteur, I will automatically table amendments countering the proposals from the Council to cut the budget. So, you have the chance to vote on that, and you needn't table separate amendments to deal with that issue. OK, thank you very much. The next item is the Director General from DG Mare, who is here, I think. So, members, I very much welcome Mr. Machado, the Director General of DG Mare, to address us. You'll know that the Director General has been in his post for 5 years? 4 years. 4 years. You'll probably also know that he's departing shortly for new opportunities. This means that he's got the opportunity, of course, to give us a no-holds-barred description of the issues we face, and I'm sure during your time you can point to some notable achievements and successes, because there have been such successes. You can also highlight some of the difficulties we face across Europe's seas. So, Mr. Machado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chris, and honourable members of the new Patch Committee. I wanted, first of all, to thank you very much for inviting me for this occasion and the opportunity to your meeting and to have an exchange of views on matters related to the oceans and fisheries policy. Most of you will be meeting for the first time, but I also see some familiar faces around, and that is always very, very good. I would like to start by expressing my and my services' deep sadness by the tragic news that arrived to us last week from the Azores, where I come from. that Andrea Bradford, one of your colleagues that was supposed to sit here in this committee, regrettably passed away at an early age. He was a very committed politician, a representative of the region, and I'm sure that he would have made a very substantial contribution to the work of your committee. And of course, I think all our thoughts now are with his family, with whom I express my deepest condolences and solidarity. I would like first, Chris, to congratulate you on your election to the European Parliament, and I would like to start by reassuring you of the full support that you will have from me and from my services whenever necessary, whenever requested. And we look forward to working very closely with you and to continue our constructive cooperation with this committee. And let me also welcome in particular the new members of this committee of the worlds of seas and oceans. Fisheries and maritime affairs is a fascinating policy which concerns all of us. Seas and oceans cover around 70% of our planet. They are crucial for human life, for our well-being and that of future generations, both as a supplier of highly nutritious food, clean and abundant energy and other natural resources, and as a regulator of our climate and many of the Earth's natural cycles, and as a driver of economic growth and technological innovation, and as a source of inspiration, imagination, and humility. For a large number of citizens, the sea is also part of their everyday life. More than 170 million Europeans live in coastal regions, and around 40% of the world's population lives less than 160 kilometers from the sea. Our oceans connect us all. Healthy and sustainable seas and oceans are a precondition for a thriving fishing sector and for prosperous coastal communities. This committee has traditionally very much focused on fisheries. But I think the time has come to recognize that we have to address ocean issues in a more holistic manner. Fisheries, blue economy, and ocean governance are closely linked and interdependent. And I trust that this committee can play a crucial role in further promoting such holistic policy approach. Today, I would like to share with you my views on our key priorities for the next months to come. It goes without saying that this is without prejudice to possible concrete initiatives which may be decided by the new College of Commissioners once it takes up its mandate. One thing seems clear to me. Oceans will inevitably feature high on the political agenda of our next mandate. The so-called European Green Deal is the first priority of the agenda for Europe, which the President-elect of the European Commission presented last week to this House. The European elections have shown that preserving our planet and our ecosystems is at the heart of citizens' concerns throughout Europe, and we must listen to these concerns. The Green Deal is about making Europe the first climate-neutral continent. Oceans do not only provide evidence of climate change, from more violent storms and rising sea levels to coral bleaching, less loss of biodiversity, or displacement of fish stocks, but oceans also offer solutions. They absorb around 25% of greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of the world's surplus heat. And fighting climate change will require using the potential of our oceans, for example, for food and energy production. The Green Deal is also about preserving our biodiversity, which includes the conservation and protection of our seas and oceans, and requires new standards cutting across trade, industry, agriculture, fisheries and economic policy more generally. Fisheries management will naturally be an integral part of these efforts towards protecting the oceans. The Green Deal is also about sustainable food along the whole value chain. One of the key objectives of our common fisheries policy is notably to ensure the traceability, security and quality of products marketed in the EU. The European Union imports around 60% of its seafood, making it the world's biggest seafood market. This is a powerful lever to promote sustainable seafood as a low-carbon food source. Aquaculture can play a key role in this regard. And the Green Deal is also about continuing our fight against plastic pollution to avoid that in a couple of years or decades we find more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish. Our work to avoid abandoned, lost or disposed fishing gear, which represents around 27% of marine litter, will continue. With your support, with the support of this committee, the Green Deal will actually also be a blue deal, or at least contain many nuances of blue. But before looking ahead, let me briefly turn back for a while and recall just some of the key issues on which we together made real progress during the last 5 years. We adopted 4 multi-annual management plans for managing fisheries. 1 for the Baltic Sea, 1 for the North Sea, 1 for the so-called Western Waters, which is Northeast Atlantic, and 1 for the Western Mediterranean, the first ever multi-annual plan in this fragile sea basin, which is the Mediterranean. We also adopted new and simplified rules on the conservation of fishery resources and the protection of marine ecosystems, the so-called technical measures, regulation. And we agreed on new rules for the sustainable management of our external fishing fleet and on a new data collection framework. The work on all these issues has clearly shown one thing. Where the Parliament and the Commission work hand in hand and share a common vision, real progress can be made to ensure the environmental, economic and social sustainability of EU fisheries and to keep our oceans healthy over the long term. The challenge that we are facing today are huge. They range from addressing the impact of climate change on our oceans to fighting loss of biodiversity in marine ecosystems, from tackling marine pollution to preserving the livelihood of our fishermen and the future of Europe's coastal communities. At the beginning of this new parliamentary term, important work lies ahead of us. In concrete terms, we have to agree on a new European Maritime and Fisheries Fund to ensure adequate funding for the next programming period that starts in 2021. We also have to reform our fisheries control system that is obviously not any longer fit for purpose anymore. And we have to reach, by 2020, the so-called maximum sustainable yield, the so-called MSY, which is the maximum catch that can be extracted from a fish population in the long term without harming the ability of the stock to reproduce. And we have also to implement the so-called landing obligation, which fully entered into force the 1st of January of this year, and prohibits the return to the sea of unwanted catches, so-called the practice of discarding. And we need also urgently to reverse the worrying situation in the Mediterranean, which is still the most overfished sea in the world. Let me be very clear. These are times when more than ever we need a common vision of sustainable fisheries, when we need more ambition, not less, and when we have to reconfirm our common objectives to keep the oceans healthy, not weaken it. Let me go a bit into more detail on each of these challenging objectives. The regulation of the common fisheries policy is very clear. Maximum sustainable yield needs to be reached by 2020. We have made good progress towards this target over the last years. In many parts of the EU, fisheries are arguably in the best shape they have been for decades. This year, 2019, the number of total allowable catches, the so-called stacks, that are set in line with the maximum sustainable yield further increased to 59. This represents 78% of all stacks that are assessed stocks. And fishing pressure on the fish stocks continues to decrease in the Northern Atlantic. As a result, fish stocks continue to be rebuilt. The average biomass in the Northeast Atlantic is now 36% higher than it was in 2003. Data clearly show that when we fish sustainably, it also pays off, not just for the environment, but for the economy as well. More sustainable fisheries improve not just the biomass of the stocks, but also the overall social economic performance of the EU fleet. The EU fleet continues to make record high profits, around 1.3 billion euros in 2017. However, we cannot be complacent, and much remains to be done, especially in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In particular, the state of the Mediterranean stocks remain extremely worrying. In the Mare Nostrum, around 87% of stocks are currently being overfished. We are collectively responsible for improving this situation in the Mediterranean. We need to intensify our efforts, not close the eyes to the reality. But worrying signs have also recently arrived from the Baltic Sea, where important stocks such as Western herring and Eastern cod are in a very poor condition. We are aware that, at least for cod, this is not only due to fishing pressure, but to a variety of factors. And still, immediate action is required. The Commission therefore will adopt today emergency measures to save the Eastern Baltic stock from the impending collapse. This will be catastrophic for the livelihood of many fishermen and coastal communities around the Baltic Sea. On the basis of scientific advice, the Commission is currently preparing its proposals for fishing opportunities in the various sea basins for 2020. These so-called total allowable catches will be decided by Member States in the Council in the autumn. For stocks in the Baltic and North Seas and in North East Atlantic, they will be set on the basis of the multi-annual management plans. The main objective of the Commission proposals, as I said, will be to reach maximum sustainable yield for all assessed stocks by 2020. No doubt this will be very challenging and require collective efforts by all actors involved. If the EU wants to continue to be a global leader for ocean sustainability, we must live up to our own standards and meet our legal obligations within our own sea basins. Another challenge we are facing is the implementation of the landing obligation for unwanted catches. The landing obligation should lead the fishing sector to choose more selective and changing fishing patterns in view of reducing unwanted catches as much as possible. As I said, since January 2019, the landing obligation is fully applicable to all commercial fisheries in European waters and also to European vessels fishing in the high seas. However, many member states still face important challenges in implementing the landing obligation, and the sector remains very critical towards this key element of our common fisheries policy. Several members of the previous PESH committee have also openly questioned the principle of the landing obligation as such. We are working closely with member states to encourage them to make use of the full range of available tools which can facilitate implementation of the landing obligation, and to better use also available funds to invest in more selective gear and better fishing techniques. And we are also carefully checking that all requests from member states for exemptions from the landing obligation are duly justified and based on sound scientific advice. If this is the case, these exemptions, which are the so-called discard plans, are adopted by the Commission in the form of delegated acts, which are scrutinized by the European Parliament and the Council, who can object to them. However, compliance with the landing obligation remains a key concern. There are many indications, including Commission audits and initiatives by the European Fisheries Control Agency, that member states do not sufficiently control and monitor the implementation of the landing obligation. We need new and innovative control systems, such as conventional controls have proven to be inadequate. The application of remote electronic monitoring systems are the most effective means for member states to ensure control and enforcement of the landing obligation at sea. This is why the Commission has proposed the use of closed-circuit television or so-called CCTV, in our proposal for a revised control regulation. I am fully aware that several members in the previous PESH committee, including the former rapporteur, have been very critical towards CCTV on board, mainly for reasons of personal data protection. I can assure you that ensuring data protection is also a key concern for the Commission, and that we will make all that is necessary that privacy data is protected. But our proposal foresees that footage from CCTVs should be recorded locally within the vessels and only be made available to Member States officials or Union inspectors in case of inspections, investigations, or audits. They would not be continuously transmitted to the Member States' competent authorities. I have to say, and I want to stress this point, that in times where each of us as citizens, we are filmed when walking through a shopping mall or stopping at a gas station, I really fail to understand the justification for excluding CCTVs in certain well-defined zones of a vessel, vessels that are involved in an economic activity in a space that belongs to all of us. This is not about intruding in fishermen's privacy. This is probably the only effective means which allows us to control if the rules which you, the members of the European Parliament, have decided together with the Council, and to ensure that these rules are respected. Talking about control, I wanted also to be clear in one point. The success or failure of the common fisheries policy depends on whether we will be able to ensure its effective implementation or not. We will not be able to achieve maximum sustainable yield and to effectively implement the landing obligation without reforming our control system. The current control system is not fit for purpose, since it reflects control strategies and methodologies of more than 10 years ago. The Commission proposal for a revised fisheries control system foresees the modernization of controls, the use of new technologies, and an equitable treatment of all operations. We have proposed to phase out paper-based tools and to harmonize the criteria for serious infringements. In this way, the new control regulation can create a level playing field in all member states when it comes to enforcement of the common fisheries policy. It is now in your hands to seize the opportunity and adopt an ambitious and modern regulation which is fit for purpose and allows us to effectively implement sustainable fisheries in Union waters. I hope that discussions on this important matter can proceed swiftly in this committee so that we can modernize our control system without further delay. Let me now say a few words on the pending Commission proposal for the new European Maritime and Fisheries Funds, EMFF, for the period 2021-2027, which is probably the most urgent file that you will have to deal with. At the end of the last legislature, in April, the previous Parliament adopted its first reading on the MFF. A couple of months later, in June, the Council adopted its partial general approach. Both positions of the Council and the Parliament go into the same direction, and they have caused deep concern and disappointment within the Commission. What we see with these positions goes the opposite way from the core objectives of our common fisheries policy, to which we jointly committed only 6 years ago. To be very frank with you, the EMFF discussions give me the sad feeling that our collective commitment towards sustainable fishing is sinking, and that we are abandoning our joint ambition. It is not acceptable, in my view, that taxpayers' money is used in a way that would jeopardize the common fisheries policy and be contrary to the European Union's international commitments. Unfortunately, some of the elements, if reintroduced in the future EMFF, risk doing precisely that. We are about to make a dangerous step backwards, which will not only affect the sustainability of our fisheries, but also undermine our credibility internationally as champions of sustainable fishing and promoters of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is now up to you as new members of this committee to decide if this is what you want. Let me briefly explain our concerns on the 3 most problematic amendments in the Parliament first reading. Firstly, investment in small-scale fishing vessels would extend the scope of support to new vessels and weaken the related conditionality that exists currently. Such support for the construction of fishing vessels significantly alter the objective of the proposal and could result in overcapacity in the sector, with damaging impact on achieving sustainable fisheries. Secondly, EU subsidies for vessel construction ended in 2004, precisely because they contributed to the situation of a very serious overcapacity in EU fishing fleet, which resulted in turn in high levels of overfishing of many fish stocks. Reintroducing such subsidies now will not be in line with the common fisheries policy that we decided together in 2013 and would contradict our international commitments in the context of the SDG Sustainable Development Goal 14 and jeopardize as well the EU's well-established international position in the ongoing negotiations under the World Trade Organization. Importantly, it would also crowd out funding for other more important investments in sustainability, such as improvements to selectivity and introduce distortions in the level playing field between fishing industries in different member states. The EMFF should address, in my view, certain market failures, but not replace the market with unjustified subsidies, especially in a sector which has been showing record profits over the last few years. Therefore, the introduction of such subsidies would lead to a significant distortion of the position. I want to be clear here and dispel any misunderstanding about the Commission position. We are in favor of subsidies that improve working conditions on board. We are in favor of financing investment that improve safety on board. But these can be made without increasing capacity. What we fail to see is why you need investments to build completely new vessels. Thirdly, of our concerns is the deletion of the 30% contribution of the MFF to climate objectives, which seriously weakens the horizontal mainstreaming of climate action across the multi-annual financial framework. The Commission has replied in detail to the various amendments adopted by the Parliament, and to some of which I just highlighted, and you can read them, our reply, which is publicly available in all languages. And again, my services and I remain, of course, available and ready to further explain our position before we enter into trilogues. During the upcoming trilogues, Member States and the Parliament have to decide if they want to stick to their commitment towards sustainable fisheries or not, whether they want to live up to the expectations of the next generation or not, whether they want to move forward or backwards, think long-term or short-term. When meeting with a candidate for Commission President a few weeks ago, most of your political groups called for the sustainability to be one of the first priorities for the new Commission. The President-elect, and we have listened, but we hope that sustainability remains a priority also for you as member of this commitment. Honourable members, the EU, I want to touch on two other points before concluding. The EU is also a major fishing nation, but also a major maritime power. And, as I said, the largest single market for fishery products in the world. We therefore have a responsibility to advance EU sustainability standards at international level and to help keeping the oceans and seas healthy, clean, safe and secure, not only within our borders, but worldwide. We need to address global challenges and at the same time to secure a level playing field for our operators. Challenge and opportunities at sea are shared and transboundary in nature. Our leadership is crucial to preserve and strengthen a multilateral rules-based order. This is why we need to act at all levels, EU level, regional, but also internationally. Our main tools and instruments to promote better governance and sustainable fisheries worldwide are the work in international organizations and fora, including at United Nations level, the work on regional fisheries management organizations, multilateral and bilateral fisheries agreements, international trade policy, and our policy to fight illegal, unreported and unregulated fisheries, so-called IUU policy. This committee will follow very closely our work on sustainable fisheries partnership agreements and on IUU. And my colleagues from my services will be coming this afternoon to speak with you to some of these topics already. Equally interlinked with EU fisheries policy and therefore of direct relevance to this committee is our work to develop the so-called sustainable blue economy. With our sustainable blue economy policy, we want to enable EU communities and companies to benefit from a dynamic ocean economy which fully respects social and environmental equilibria. The value of the EU's blue economy is likely to double in the next decade and could reach €1 trillion by 2030. This is twice the gross domestic product of Belgium. Emergent sectors from renewable energy and offshore aquaculture to maritime surveillance and blue biotechnology are reshaping and diversifying the maritime industry. I hope that we can work closely together also with this committee to put in place the context, the conditions in which our economic operators from emerging and traditional sectors can thrive in the wider ocean economy. Honourable members, before concluding, let me say a few final words on Brexit. As you know, the Commission continues to work on the assumption of an orderly departure on the basis of the negotiated withdrawal agreement, which includes a transition period and bilateral negotiations leading to a long-term agreement on economic relations after 2020. After the transition period and for the long-term relationship with the UK, our main objective will be to secure a sustainable use of the over 100 fish stocks that will become shared with UK from one day to the other, based negotiations which will be based on the guidelines drafted by the Council in 2018. This challenge is enormous. We currently share with Norway around 7 stocks, and the negotiations are difficult every year. With the United Kingdom, from one day to the next, we will have around 100 share stocks that we will need to negotiate with them. However, the risk of a no-deal scenario has increased, as you know, over the last months. And the Commission has also prepared very carefully for the scenario of a so-called hard Brexit. I sincerely hope that in the case Brexit should happen, we will be able to continue our successful fisheries relationship with the United Kingdom beyond the date of withdrawal. Honourable members, I want to thank you once again for the opportunity to have this exchange of views today with you. And I look forward to exchanging and trying to reply to any questions you may have. I'm sorry for being a bit long, but I thought this was a first good occasion to paint you a panorama, and I have not entered in many of the issues that will be dealt already later this afternoon, like SFPAs, fisheries agreements, or other situations, but I would be ready to try to reply to any questions that you may have. And again, we are very honoured to work with you, looking forward to have close cooperation and to work hand in hand with this Commission. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Machado. You've said many important things, reminding us that overfishing in the Mediterranean, 87%, you said? And that presumably means that every single day, the situation gets worse. And you have to, you as the Commission, has to ask yourselves whether, despite the fact that a number of measures have been introduced, whether you're doing enough, given the state of affairs. Second point I'd just like to raise before asking the coordinators to enter the debate is this point about the EMFF. You have said that the amendments adopted by the Parliament create the situation where we may be undermining the sustainability objectives of the common fisheries policy. And personally, I agree with you. But do not expect the Parliament to change its position. Institutionally, we are now defending a position that was adopted at first reading. Our negotiators have been given a mandate. They will go in to negotiate with the Council. You may not like that. I may not like that. But the power is with you. If the Commission wishes to withdraw that proposal and start again, that's with you. But the Parliament is now in a position where it is. So, you can express your concerns, but, do understand the situation. Don't if you like, don't avoid the reality that you have an opportunity to change things if you wish. We do not necessarily have that opportunity. Now, we have about an hour to put questions. Well, yes, I'm allowed to express my personal view. I'm also defending the committee and the Parliament's position. I hope you accept that. Right. We have about an hour. I don't want to group questions if it's possible. I'd like short questions and get an answer, and rather than having sort of a generality. So we start with coordinators. In theory, up to 3 minutes, but if you can keep that to less, I'd be grateful. And then 1 minute interventions from other members. So, Mr. Mian Mon.
Gracias, Presidente. Gracias a...
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Director General for coming here. And thank you also for the efforts that you've made over these years, because you've always been open to reacting, and that's worth quite a lot here in Brussels. So thank you. And for the future Commission, I'm happy to see that the Commission is aware of sustainability, environmental issues, which of course we all are, but also the economic and social aspects and how fishing touches on employment. We know that sustainability is important, but we also have men and women working day to day in the fisheries sector, fishing, processing, etc. We are starting a new parliament, and you referred to the fund. Yes, we're all getting familiar with the fund. It's going to be a complex issue. I don't want to open a whole debate on that, but in line with what the Chair said, we all know that this report was passed on first reading by about 500 members. And perhaps there are things that the Commission don't like, but there'll be trilogue, there'll be dialogue, and Parliament will be constructive to try to reach understandings. But nobody's questioning the fund or the international commitments that we've taken. But what we're talking about is improving conditions and sustainability on vessels. And you know this is extremely important for the future generations. If living conditions don't improve for future generations, then we won't have any fishermen left. There have been reports in the Spanish press, and here we have a fisherman saying there are no fishermen left in our village. The fathers don't want their children to go into this profession. We're talking about better way of life. We're not talking about increasing fishing capacity. Yes, we're going to have trilogues, and we'll try to reach a consensus. In the technical measures, for example, I remember there was criticism of the line that was taken, but at the end of the day, we reached an agreement in trilogue. Mr. Machado was rapporteur on that, and I very much hope that we'll reach an agreement, a balanced agreement between the three institutions. That's why we're all here. Then a few specific questions, as the Chair asked. Landing obligation. What is going to happen there? And then what's happening further on? 2022, is there going to be a new CFP? And then also, can you explain the situation on the northern border of Mauritania? There's some kind of blockage, and every 2 weeks or so the same thing happens, and fishermen from my constituency are very concerned about this. There are 11 vessels that have been that are affected basically on a weekly basis by the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. EMFF, landing obligation, Mauritania.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Yes, and to you as well. I know that the Parliament adopted first reading position. This committee has many new members. I think it's good to make clear what are the concerns of the Commission, and we also share that during the trilogues we hope that we can find a constructive solution to these concerns. But I think it's my duty to come here and express the points of concern that the Commission has with regard to the position. Then it's up to you then to decide how you are going to approach the trilogues. The landing obligation. Well, the landing obligation, of course, requires that fishermen change the way they have been fishing in the past, that they adopt more selective gears, that they have different fishing techniques, and this requires an effort and certainly a cost for adaptation. But the landing obligation was decided jointly by the Parliament and the Council. And I think that you want us to implement and enforce it. So the question today is how best to enforce it. The Commission has been discussing since 2 years or more with the Member States, first, the use of the different policy tools that are available in the common fishery policy. Secondly, the use of funds that the MFF provide. And when I look at the funds being used, they are not being used very much. The funds that are available are not being fully used. So, so there are means. I'm not saying this is an easy. It's a difficult one. But I think what we don't want is that this policy that was co-decided by you and the Council back in 2013, that it's completely disregarded and that the practice of discarding back to sea continues. And the point that I was making, if we want to control this effectively, it's only through CCTV cameras. I mean, you cannot control what's happening at sea by aerial surveys or other traditional means. We should have no illusion. And again, my point, I understand that it was very controversial, the use of cameras on board. But the point I wanted to make is that even truck drivers, they have systems on board that monitor when they stop, when they sleep, when they serve. I mean, we don't want to have cameras all over the vessels, but on certain areas where the fish comes in, so that you can see what is happening. The decision is yours. If you want a proper implementation, we need proper means of control and effective means. Then, the new CFP after 2021, as you know, the regulation on the CFP provides that by the end of 2022, the Commission will come to the Council and to the Parliament with a report on the implementation of the CFP. And I think following the discussion of that report, then we will have a discussion, does it need to be reformed, in what direction, when will the reform happen? My personal view, I think it will be happening only, of course, by the dates later in this mandate. And because we need first to deal with a very urgent issue, two very important issues. One is the full implementation of the current policy. Secondly, digest Brexit, which will have an impact on the CFP. And only once we have seen the implications of these two, then can we be better informed to then discuss what direction should we go in the future. Mauritania, this was raised already last week by my team that was in Rabat, discussed with Moroccan authorities. This is being raised today in Mauritania by a team that left yesterday from Brussels and will be there this week. So people are aware, they are trying to find a solution, but until now the discussions are taking place with authorities in the different governments.
Mrs. Aguilera.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Welcome to Director General Machado. Welcome back. Perhaps we could start with what we ended off. That's the crisis in Mauritania. It is a problem. And it doesn't have an easy solution. But they are withholding our fishermen for 7-8 days at a stretch. So we have to see what sort of measures can be taken. I know you're on the case, and I hope you can contribute to clarifying the situation. I've got a question about Brexit, which you did touch upon. I wonder if your Directorate General is already working on post-October 31 scenarios. I very much fear we'll have Boris Johnson across the table from us. That's not good news. So my question for you is, what sort of work are you doing in terms of preparing possible fisheries agreements? Are you already working on that? Have you been making progress? Because fisheries is a very delicate subject, as all policy areas are, but I just would like to know what your Directorate General has been doing in this particular area. Morocco, we're very pleased to see that our fishing fleet is back in Moroccan waters. This is huge news for the Spanish fleet in particular. Also, with Vietnam, we will be having an opinion on Vietnam on the fisheries agreement there, but let me just tell you now that Vietnam has a yellow card for fisheries. I'd like to know what the Commission's view is, what your view is on this agreement, above and beyond all of the trade considerations which don't affect us. But whether the idea of having a major agreement with a country that has a yellow card in terms of IUU fishing is advisable, and whether we can make it clear to the Commission just how important that is. So I'd like to hear your views on that. Aquaculture now, that was very briefly touched upon here. I know there are so many things to deal with in such little time, but I think that aquaculture in Europe does need a bit of a boost. We're actually going backwards instead of forwards. There are other parts of the world, there are other countries where they're really investing in aquaculture and we're seeing growth there. Aquaculture is a very interesting alternative. And instead of making progress, we're actually doing the opposite. I think we need to give it more of a boost, and more help to this sector in general in the years to come. Just wrapping up, that was a lot of work that's going to be done with EMFF, with the agreement that has been made at the Parliament. Now, a lot of respect for the work that you do. I'm not going to get into that discussion right now, but really, we haven't got much time, and I'm going to say, well, we're good friends, you know, you're not around for much longer, so let's just stick with the friendship and not get into the unpleasant bits. But the opinion that was adopted here in the Parliament had a clear majority behind it. It reflects many different perspectives, but I can tell you this, and this is just a personal opinion. I think one of the problems that we see in the low implementation of the current EMFF is really how it's been done. It's true, the operational programs were adopted quite late in the day. I'm wrapping up, Chair. But the EMFF took decisions and measures that were simply impossible to implement. And I hope that we'll get a second chance to do it right. Thank you very much, and my apologies, Chair, for going over time.
Thank you. Just to let you know that we will be discussing Vietnam in more detail this afternoon. But there's a key point here, of course, which is, you know, if you want to stop illegal fishing, if you want to put some pressure on that country, it's when you're negotiating the trade agreement. And you know, why are we even thinking about negotiating the trade agreement so long as illegal fishing is continuing?
Okay, thank you. First, on Brexit, and thank you very much, Mrs. Aguilera, for your questions. On Brexit, yes, my services have been working already on a future agreement for the last 1 year and a half, since the beginning. We have not yet started discussions with the Council. There will be a mandate that the Council will issue to the Commission, but the groundwork is done. So we have been working on these very systematically, and we know fully what is the situation, what are the challenges, and the direction that we would like to go. Vietnam, yes, a yellow card, yeah, the ratification of the trade agreement certainly it's a lever to make them change their policies. So the agreement has been negotiated and concluded. I think what is happening now is the ratification. The thing that you need to consider, and I'll be very clear on this to you, the changes that are required to change the IUU in Vietnam and to move towards more sustainable fisheries will imply adopting laws, will imply changing control systems, will imply more personnel. In the case of Thailand, took 3 years and a half. In the case of Taiwan, took 3 years and a half before the card was lifted. My question is, can you use the lever of non-ratification for 3 years? Because it will take time. This is not something that you can do one day to the other. But I would also say, even if the agreement is ratified, nothing prevents, if they don't move in the right direction, and if it's necessary to go to a red card, nothing prevents from closing the EU market to Vietnam's fishery products, even with an FTA. So that instrument is always available, and that's what we need to make sure. That's really the way I would put to you, and I think it's a fair picture of the situation. Then aquaculture, I fully agree with you. Aquaculture is growing again in Europe, but still much less than other parts of the world. But some of the problems that we have, because we have done a lot of work with the sector, is the the licensing procedure. I mean, sometimes in some member states it took 5 years. 5 years to get a license, because you need from different ministries, environment, from that it's not sure that you can use that coastal part for aquaculture. Can you imagine any investor that invests for 5 years, and then when he starts, he still needs 4 years to get some return? I mean, no one is going to put their money into this. So we have been working, and now in my services we are going to start reviewing the guidelines for aquaculture in the EU to try to move to the next step. But we are fully aware, and we are trying to, with the sector, to reduce and simplify so that the business conditions are better for the sector to be developed. EMFF, yes, provocative. It's useful. You need sometimes to be provocative, but not completely. When I see some member states asking that we reintroduce construction subsidies for the construction of vessels up to 40 meters, I mean, I think provocative is not enough. Up to 40 meters. While I know that currently, for example, in the Vigo ports, there are 25 vessels being constructed. And in last year, 5 new vessels are being constructed with private money. So there is no need. The vessels are being constructed without the need of European financing and subsidies. But I was provocative, yes, but I think it's important that I pass to you the feeling that we have also on this side. But again, the trilogues, I think we will be able to find common ground.
Okay, obviously I'm looking at the clock and wanting to cover ground, so bear that in mind, please. Mr. Kalskin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair, and my thanks to the Director General as well. Good morning, everyone. You've raised a lot of points, and you've issued a lot of challenges for the coming years. We've got Brexit you talked about. We talked about the future of our oceans on a more general level, climate change, biodiversity, a lot of things at stake here which directly affect us. It's going to be one of the goals of the CFP and implementing the CFP correctly so it can meet its objectives. But there's also a question of the reform of the CFP, following the review of it, deciding whether we need to reform it or not. Ensuring implementation in order to meet climate objectives, environmental objectives, biodiversity objectives, but also at the same time to ensure that it helps the sector, which of course is responsible for a lot of jobs, to ensure that it is the best for the coastal communities, which many of us come from. Of course, we don't fish just for the fun of fishing, for the pleasure of it. We're also talking about ensuring food security for Europe. I think it's important to recall that as well whenever we talk about fisheries and aquaculture. So we have this financial instrument, which is EMFF, and it's important for us to consider everything that's on the table, the various issues at stake. We want to have an ambitious budget. The Parliament actually was the request to increase the budget from the original proposal. We also need to be able to implement the EMFF on time and correctly to ensure that it is in line with the issues being faced by the sector. Of course, we know this means we need to have better vessels, safer vessels, more selective gear. And the industry is taking steps in that direction in responding to these concerns. And I think we need to accompany them in that, and that is one of the main objectives of the MFF. At the same time, it's very important that the EMMF respect commitments that have been undertaken at an international level by the EU. So, if there are concerns expressed about subsidies being harmful, well, then we need to ask that question. And over the course of the trilogue, we will try to answer it. Raise the concerns.
Specifically put the question.
Yes.
Good points. I agree with you, but put the points.
Yes, I was about to get to the questions, Chair. So, my questions then. Very straightforward. Is the Commission willing to support an increase to the budget for the EMFF as proposed by the Parliament? A question on Brexit as well. You already answered it, but specifically on Brexit, if there is no deal, would you be willing to act quickly as possible to get a fisheries agreement that everyone can be happy with? And finally, we all know this, climate change, biodiversity, we've only got about 10 years to take decisive action. So my question is, in the next 5 years of this legislative term, what proposals will the Commission be making affecting the CFP and comprehensive approach in order to take into account what's at stake? Thank you.
Très bien. Merci, Monsieur Karlskin.
Thank you very much, and my thanks to Mr. Karlskin for those very interesting questions. Is the Commission willing to increase the budget? Well, the Commission's proposed what it's proposed, so that's been made. And the proposal that we made is a nominal reduction of 5%. That's the share of the UK financing, basically. So that's the system that was adopted for all of the funds, actually, in the Commission's proposal, because the Commission thought with one less member state, there won't be much appetite on the part of the other member states to put even more money on the table. So our proposal was that. We'll have to see what the Council and the Parliament have to say about it, if they want to increase the budget or not. That's been set for the MFF. Your second point, Brexit. Yes, well, of course. If there is going to be a no deal, departure, then I think, of course, we'll do everything we can do in order to make sure that the negotiations that we need to do with the UK are done as quickly as possible. Well, of course, you know that negotiations takes two to tango, takes two to negotiate, and so it's not enough for us to say that we want to act quickly. We'll have to see what happens. From the Commission side, at least, I can assure you that we're ready to go, and we will do everything that we can to come up with an agreement as quickly as possible. And finally, on maritime policy and on the fisheries policy, I think first we need to see what the impact of Brexit will be on our policy, our fisheries policy, while continuing, of course, to implement the CFP. And we have until the end of 2022 to come back to the Council and the Parliament with a report on implementation. And that, I'm sure, will be the time for us to establish next steps. I don't see what the point would be in bringing that process forward. Personally, I think it would be in the interest of everyone to first digest Brexit and then see what sort of adjustments will be necessary after that.
Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair, and hello, Senor Machado. I'd like to address the issue of subsidies, because subsidies, as we know, are a tool that can be used to protect or plunder the oceans and fish stocks. As we know, the European Union has ongoing negotiations in the WTO in terms of fisheries subsidies, and also, you know, in terms of the subsidies in terms of overcapacity and overfishing, and also to eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal and unreported, unregulated fisheries. Also, the European Union has signed the international agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, as you already referred to, and particularly 14.6, which prohibits subsidies that will cause harm by 2020. But what we see is that the European Parliament and the Council, in terms of positions on the MFF, that we see that they contain a kind of contradiction to those agreements and discussions at international level. So my question, Senor Machado, is how can you assure us that in the coming years that subsidies will be given that will support sustainable fisheries, support sustainable jobs, sustainable communities, but that it will be done in a consistent way that's not actually a contrary to what we're saying externally, so that our internal speak is good and positive, and that externally that it is so too, so that we're not seen as a European Union of contradiction. Thank you.
And you kept within time. Well done.
Thank you very much for your question, Mrs. O'Sullivan. The importance of these, and I think we all need to be aware, the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030, not only was subscribed by the European Union, by all heads of state and government of the UN membership, including the 28 heads of state and government of the EU. Among the Sustainable Development Goals, you have, as you mentioned, SDG 14, which is life underwater. And there you have one of the goals is to conclude by 2020, next year, a negotiation in WTO that bans harmful subsidies that lead to overcapacity, overfishing, and also subsidies that promote IUU fishing. First point, if we miss the 2020 deadline for concluding these negotiations, I think it risks putting in jeopardy the credibility of the whole SDG system, because you start missing deadlines. Secondly, I can tell you that other partners in Geneva are looking very, very, very concerned to what is happening in the discussions of the MFF. You should not forget that the first European proposal, European Union proposal, it's not Commission, the European Union proposal that was put on the table of WTO 2 years ago was to ban subsidies that led to vessel construction. The negotiations have evolved. Yes, they are still being, consensus does not yet exist, so they are still moving. But our first proposal was prohibition of subsidies that led to vessel and capacity increases. And now, when you see the discussions that are happening with requests to introduce subsidies to construct vessels of 40 meters or 30 meters, how can these be in conformity with the positions that we are defending? I cannot see. Again, and I want to be clear, and a point that was also raised by Mr. Milan Mons. Of course, we know very well that we need also to take fully account of the difficulties of the fishermen and the need for better working conditions on board, particularly, and I agree fully, if you want to attract a new generation to come to the sector. They are not prepared to live and to work in the conditions that their parents used to work. So I come from an island where very small vessels, I know what is living and working there. But my point is that you can improve working conditions and you can improve safety without necessarily giving money to buy new vessels. This is the point that we need to see. Okay? Okay?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Mrs. Conte.
Caro Direttore.
Director, thank you very much for being here today, and thank you for offering this possibility to have a discussion about future changes. There are 3 legacy files from the last Parliament, and I'm new here, but I know that there is one in particular where there is a real concern, the multi-annual plan for small pelagics in the Adriatic. And some of your staff have defined this as a zombie plan. And with all due respect to my predecessors, I would really like clarification on this and how you intend to proceed. So that's one question. And then you mentioned climate change. I'd like to know if the Commission intends to provide ad hoc funds to deal with these changes, particularly for small fisheries, small fishermen. And there is a real issue of economic sustainability of fisheries for that sector. Then on the controls regulation and the upcoming EMFF discussions, we need proper support if compliance is very costly for ever smaller fisheries. Now, the European Parliament has given a very clear view, 497 to 93 votes, but the Council doesn't seem to be taking note of that. I can understand the Commission's position, but we're talking about a cut of 4.6%, and isn't that a real interference in something that was already voted on? I've got further things to say, but I'll wait for your responses.
Thank you very much for your points. On the Adriatic, the way the discussions turned were, in the end, very worrying for the Commission. Why? Because it was not respecting the CFP. It was leading to a situation of overfishing. It was not dealing with the situation of anchovy, because in that case, small pelagics was essentially anchovy and sardines. But the discussions that happened in the previous committee was to mix the two, and this would have continued the overfishing. And none of the key tenets of the CFP was being observed. So hopefully there was a discussion that took place in the General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean, so-called GFCM, and it was agreed there, emergency measures. And I think our intention is to continue those emergency measures in the years to come, and map a multi-annual plan for small pelagics in the Adriatic. Maybe we come back to it when the conditions are better. But as they were, we were heading into a direction that was really contrary to the direction we should be going. Secondly, climate change. Yes, as I indicated in the MFF, we have committed that at least 30% of the funds will be directed to activities that will have an impact on climate change. And this has been changed to 25 in the first reading position. Finally, control regulation. I fully agree with you. But today, even small-scale fisheries, small-scale are defined as fisheries vessels that have less than 12 meters and that do not use towed gears. There are ways of controlling through mobile devices and reporting on the catches through mobile means that are not a burden. But you need also the small scale to report on what they are fishing and the location where they are fishing, and also to record properly what are their operations at sea. The MFF, as we proposed by the Commission, for the small scale, less than 12 meters, would pay 100% to institute this recording. Well, the situation, if I can very briefly paint the situation, which I think is very interesting. The small scales today, under the current system, they have plenty of exemptions. They don't need to record their catches. They don't need to give, we don't know what is their exact location. Now, let's take a look at the Mediterranean. More than 80% of the fleet in the Mediterranean is small fishing, small coastal fishing. Well, usually we tend to think small is beautiful, very sustainable. Look at the state of the stocks. It's the most overfished region, in part because they have been exempted for all. They don't have to report on the catches. We don't know. The scientists cannot know. I think something needs to be changed. So again, we don't want to impose on them the same obligations as the big industrials. But today, as I say again, there are more than ways that you can register the catches that you are getting, even if you are a small vessel. Otherwise, that's where you find the situation of the Mediterranean. It's overfishing all over. And we cannot say that it's because Morocco, Algeria, and the others. No, I'm speaking overfishing in EU waters. So we cannot put on the back of other people. So this is what we intend to do. And again, there will be financing 100% for the small-scale fleet to do that.
We're covering a lot of ground, but we're also running out of time, so I'm going to have to start grouping questions. Mrs. Tomasic.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Machado, as regards maps for small Adriatic Sea, scientists have proven that stocks have in fact increased in size, perhaps not as much for anchovies as for sardines. For almost 2 years, we had discussions and negotiations on this matter, and the Commission always maintained the same idea, requesting quotas. So I wonder, does DG Murray continue to propose this proposal to introduce quotas for small pelagics in the Adriatic, or is some alternative proposal being considered? Another question. We are aware of the importance of multi-annual plans. Therefore, I would like to take the opportunity and ask you the following. What are the priorities as regards new proposals for multi-annual plans in the area of the Mediterranean, especially as regards the Adriatic Sea? Is multi-annual plan prepared for the demersal stock in the Adriatic? And also, what are future priorities as regards multi-annual plans for the remainder of the Mediterranean? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pereira?
Sim, obrigado, Presidente.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair, and my thanks to Director General as well for joining us today. You were talking about the positive development of a number of different stocks here, and a few times you also talked about the fact that the sector's reached record numbers in recent years. Now, the most recent indicator of MSC is not something that can be used as a conclusion in order to assume that the socioeconomic situation of the sector is positive as well. On the contrary, we're very far from that. So some figures are looking good, but in some particular areas, particularly small-scale artisanal coastal fisheries, and in certain member states, the situation is anything but. It continues to be in a major and deep economic and social crisis for the sector. And I don't think we can lose sight of that reality. Now, you also took a holistic approach and you talked about thinking beyond fisheries. Yes, well, that's all well and good, but we have to remember that the common fisheries policy is precisely that. It's one of the few and one of the oldest common policies that the European Union has. Of course, we can't try and go beyond what our mandate is. We should at least try and ensure we have enough in the budget to meet the objectives of the policy itself. We don't want to have an underfunded CFP. Nothing against a holistic approach and a global approach for our oceans and other common policies for other areas, but we need to at least have resources available for all of that. We can't be in a situation where the fisheries themselves, which are actually the exclusive competency of the EU, unlike in other areas where there might be shared competencies. Here we're talking about an exclusive competence of the EU, and we're seeing a consistent underfunding of the policy and the sector. And this brings me to the question of the EMFF. Here, Director General, I can only recommend that the Commission be a bit more open to this, less rigid, more flexible, and avoid this knee-jerk rejection of certain positions which apparently just following the script that the Commission has set you. What has been adopted by the Parliament does not necessarily imply leading to overcapacities. I don't think we need to scare our new members by saying such things. I could say that this is an opinion that was adopted by a large majority, and it found the support of a number of groups from left to right, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it will lead to overcapacity. Now, if this is one of the concerns the Commission has, and I can understand that that would be a fair concern, well, in that case, the Commission needs to address that concern within the framework of what has been proposed by the European Parliament and look at it in that context, because it can be done. Now, we agree that the Commission does not want to prevent investment in improving safety and improving working conditions on board vessels. We need to be able to consider, for instance, older vessels being replaced by newer vessels. Older vessels cannot be upgraded in the way that you're proposing in many cases. We need to renew the fleet in many member states as a result. And my final point, Chair, very briefly, if you could give us an update on the infringement situation with respect to all the member states, and also with the suspension of payments as a result of controls. Is there anything ongoing right now, or have all of them been concluded? And a final question with relate to the sardines fishery. I recently expressed my concerns about the sardine fishery. I just want to know whether this is being taken into account with the recent situations, saying that there has been an increase in the resources and an increase in biomass in the region. Thank you.
Lots of questions crammed in. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be...
Chair, just a point of order, please. Could we not all have all of the questions noted down and then have the answers at the very end? Because I'm looking at the Commission. I think it would be helpful, and time is running out, and we have got a lot of different questions, and we do this actually in other circumstances as well.
You are next, but I just want the Director General to respond to the coordinators.
Thank you. The scientists have shown that in the Adriatic is increased. Well, this is something that needs to be looked very carefully. The Commission, for the moment, as I said, the only intention that we have is to work within the context of GFCM. One thing that we have discussed this in the past, and you know very well, Mrs. Tomacic, in the Mediterranean, it's a no-go area to have tax that has been used in other sea basins. What I can tell you is that the same species, anchovies and sardines, some years ago they had trouble in the Bay of Biscay. We adopted tax there, and the stock recovered and in good shape. Yeah. So I don't see why in the Mediterranean is so different that you cannot have tax there. But for the moment, as I said, we work within the context of the GFCM. As for the new maps, we are considering internally what others we will come forward. There is not yet a decision, but you are right, there are still other regions or other species that will need to be covered with multi-annual plans. Then I know, Mr. Ferreira, that the situation is not the same across all segments. But what I wanted to make is that overall, and many of the segments, they have been profitable with a rate of 19%, 20%. If you look at many other economic sectors during the crisis, 18%, 19% is not bad at all. So they have been. And the CFP and the FEAMP and the EMFF also has funding for oceans, for climate change, for maritime blue growth. But it's under direct management. And what I see is that both the Council and the Parliament are reducing the envelope on direct management. This is the part that is managed directly by the Commission. So if we want really to go into these areas, which I believe we should, we need also to have the envelope on direct management slightly increased. And the reason, I know this is a Fisheries Committee, but when you look at climate change and the oceans, the impact is that fish stocks are moving elsewhere. We need to look at these not only from a fisheries point of view, we need to have a broader view. Because you can decide tax, but you go into the sea and the stocks are no longer there anymore. So I think we need to have a broader view. Yes, the Commission should be less rigid. I mean, you yourself said that investments would not necessarily lead, but could lead what we want is to avoid that this leads to higher capacity, but I think we need to work during the trilogues on ways to limit the risk of such thing happening. Finally, sardines. Yes, I make a comment on an interview saying that the stock has been in a very poor situation. The scientists are telling that. I was not saying in that interview that more cuts are needed. I said that it has been in a difficult situation and the sector and the government are making efforts. Now that you have sardines now in the sea, as some people claim, let be reviewed by the scientists in ICES, and we come back to that later in the year.
Thank you. This is all about time management. I don't think I'm succeeding very well. Right, can I pass it to members now? It's 1 minute questions. Please keep them as specific as possible. Mr. Schreier-Perrick.
Thank you, Chair. I will try and do precisely that. I have a question from the Netherlands. It's about the landing obligations and the exceptions or exemptions. And I think a lot needs to be done with respect to the exemptions instead of having these cameras installed everywhere to make sure the landing obligations are respected. This point's already been made. The situation with landings is a major concern for the Netherlands. The Commission apparently has no idea what the situation is in practice on the ground. In the Netherlands, we have a very good system in place, and apparently the Commission now wants to forbid it. That can't be the case. They should at least look to see what the situation is like in the Netherlands before they make any decisions. There are a lot of issues related to landing obligations for fish for human consumption, and we know that in case it needs to be kept on ice, but then you have hot weather, and then you have all the issues related to the food quality. Also, the quality of fish will vary over time, depending on where it's caught. And all of this needs to be taken into account when setting the system. So if a market operator cannot meet all of the requirements, then they cannot land the fish. And so here comes my question. So this apparently is not the case for the Netherlands, but for all of Europe. This is just one example from my I'm a full member of the group, so I should have a bit more time, not unlike others. So you have to remember that the purchasing and the landing and the selling sites are different across all of Europe. So you need to look not just at the situation in the Netherlands, but also across the entire EU, and also look at the question of exemptions. My question is about the exemptions.
Mr. Ryson.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. 2 hele korte...
Thank you. Just 2 brief points from me. You talked about the production itself and the at sea. Now you see this as an opportunity, but actually I also think there are a lot of threats to fisheries there as well. If you think about the North Sea, for instance, there's a plan in place of 22,000 windmills, and in the North Sea now there are windmills being built left and right, and you talked about creating energy from the sea, but we have to think about the threats related to that. So what is DG Mare's role there? Should we not be thinking maybe about research being put into this? If we think about the effects on fisheries of all of these plans, you talk about a holistic approach, and I think this really is part of that approach. The second point has to do with the landing obligations. We have a lot of complaints about the system. Now, we know that systems have been identified under the technical measures. There have been agreements that have been made, but we think there is a need to evaluate the situation quite quickly. And do you see the possibility of such an evaluation taking place at any point soon? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. D'Amato. Mr. D'Amato.
Thank you, Chair. If on the one hand we haven't got studies on who's to blame for stock reduction and whether the small fishermen are to blame, well, we've been talking about drilling, too many cargo ships, all these issues which could be the main causes we have to fight against. And the discard ban and the landing obligation, well, last time we dealt with this in the EMFF context, and we thought the Commission was in agreement with specific assistance to given to small fisheries when it came to conserving the fish. Now, what happens to this catch? Can't it be used to fight poverty? And if we remember what was done in agriculture to help with marketing, there was a program for fruit and vegetables and milk at school. Why can't we have a program providing fish?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Given the overwhelming win for the Brexit Party in the recent European elections and the weight of opinion in the UK's fishing industry, will the Director acknowledge and accept that the UK has the right to be an independent coastal state post-Brexit? Further to this, will the Director recognise that the British fishing industry deserves to be free from EU interference in its affairs and that the UK government alone has the right to redistribute fishing opportunities in UK waters that were previously given to EU vessels under equal access rules? And to help you understand, I have a booklet for you, sir, and for you, Mr. Davis, and I did have one for Peter Van Dalen, but obviously he's not here today, our Vice President, so I'd like to give you that at the end. Thank you very much.
58 seconds. Thank you very much. Spot on. Madame Chabot.
Oui, merci. Yes, thank you very much, Director General. I'm very glad that in your presentation you talked about global issues relating to the oceans, knowledge, the blue economy, governance. I'm a new member here, and like you, I support the role that Europe can play when tackling with these issues. We have 25 million square kilometers of sea. You talked about the Green Deal and the Commission's ambition in that respect. But my question is how Europe can respond to these challenges. How do we make Europe a maritime power? There are geo-strategic issues. And what about European governance of the seas? Because the Fisheries Committee is the only committee dealing with these maritime issues.
I think, Director General, you should reply to that batch.
I go back?
Please.
Okay. Thank you very much, all of you. First, Mrs. Schreier, I wanted to come back to your point. As I said, the landing obligation is a major challenge for the sector and for governments to control. And the exemptions that are provided there, which were decided, again, by and co-decided by this House and the Council, they serve a purpose, but they render, in my view, the control even more difficult. Some of the exemptions, I give two examples. Survivability. If the fish, even if it comes aboard, but if it has a high rate of survivability, then you can throw back to the sea. Second exemption, minimum size. In principle, you should not catch fish that are undersized. But if you only do 5% of fishing, you can catch 5% that is undersized. Then you have to bring on board when you come to port. Now, if we put ourselves in the sense of 1 year, you go to the sea, and how do you calculate the 5% on everything that you fish? Okay, how can you do that? I mean, this is a huge challenge. And if you don't have means of controlling directly what is happening, I mean, they come to land, and no one knows if discarding is going on or not. The information that we receive from our audits and from the European Fisheries Control Agency is that discarding is continuing. If you don't have means of control, how can you make sure that this is implemented? But again, these exemptions are provided in the basic regulation, and they are entitled to use them. Then, the threats, the windmills, and certainly. And one of the things that is a major preoccupation is that we better organize the maritime space. I think, like it or not, the hard reality is that more and more activities will take place in the sea. So the best way that we can do is to manage, organize it the best possible way. And this is maritime spatial planning. I think it's important that we organize the space otherwise, but this will happen. And certain things we need to be very careful on what we do, particularly deep sea minings and things of that sort. But these activities are going to happen. We need to organize them. And research money will be power into that. Don't forget that for the first time ever in the New Horizon Europe, there will be one of the 4 missions, or 5, each one on the oceans, with 1 billion euros, which will be shared by Pascal Lamy. So for the first time, we have under the research program of the Union, one of the missions which is on the oceans. And we certainly are going to use this to deal with many of the challenges that we are facing. Then, as UK, the UK will be a coastal state when it leaves the EU. For all your other questions, we will discuss during the negotiations. We certainly have many things to discuss when we enter into negotiations with UK. But for the moment, we are still in the hope that we can organize a proper way out for the UK from the Union. And finally, Madame Chabot, l'Union européenne, vous le savez mieux que personne.
As you know better than anyone else, the EU is already a major maritime power, but we do need to organise better. And once again, it's very important to organise the maritime area. Now, the global population is going to go up to 9 billion, and land-based resources won't be enough. And of course, a lot of CO2 is produced. Fishing activities may be an alternative, but we're not going to invade the maritime area and have aquaculture farms everywhere. We need proper organisation of that area, and we need caution, we need prudence. That's our key word. Because if you look at the damage which has been caused on Earth, on the land, which is visible, well, that didn't stop us causing environmental disasters, even when you could see that. And at sea, you can't always see that. And there's a massive potential for environmental disasters, so we need to be very, very prudent here.
Mrs. Tardino, you note the time, so.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Director. You've said that 80% of Mediterranean stocks are overfished. You confirmed that statement when answering questions. Now, could you share those data? When do they refer to? Because it has been said that in the Mediterranean the scientists don't have very certain data, and there are a lot of limitations to fishing in the Mediterranean. Mr. Ferreira made one point where you were talking about peaks, and I'm wondering which country this refers to, peaks in turnover, because in Italy we're close to collapse.
Quickly.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Machado, for your intervention this morning, and particularly I would like to say, to reassure you, Mr. Ferreira said that you might scare new members. I'm one of the new members. I didn't get scared. Maybe the reason is because I worked many decades in the fishing industry. A couple of points. First of all, you talked about the implementations, and you talk about innovative ways and modern way for implementation. And you talk about CCTV. Can I remind you that Scottish fishermen had CCTV since 2009 in their vessels? This is not neither innovative or modern. I would love you to come with a list of what modern and innovative implementation you are thinking about. The second point will be, you will be surprised on Brexit. You said...
No, enough.
Let me... I was one
you won't get an answer. You simply won't get an answer if you carry on. I'm sorry. Please.
Well, if you want, we can speak afterwards. What I said, I'm not saying that it was not my intention that CCTV would be the flagship of what is innovation. No, what I was saying is that even for small scale, you have much modern ways that are less burdensome, like telephones, mobiles, through which you can register. Currently, it's on a paper base, it's heavy. But with these new means, which is not only CCTVs, you can do a proper registration of the catches, and that's what I was referring to. But we can discuss bilaterally if you want. All right, thank you. Well, to be honest, Mrs. Tardino, it's not my idea that it's 86% overfished. Are the scientists that have produced that. If you want, we can supply you with the figures and the latest assessment that was made.
So there you are. I've spent 15 years on the committee and criticising committee chairs for not managing these question sessions properly, and now I find myself in the dock. I apologise to those who I've not been able to call. I shall try and learn the lessons and manage the time better. However, we have covered an enormous amount of ground. So, Director General, thank you very much. When are you leaving us? Beginning of October. Okay. Well, I hope you don't take any summer holidays and carry on, making these policies work properly. Thank you very much. We meet again at 2:30.